Red Cloud, the war chief who defeated an empire. The wind howled across the frozen plains of Wyoming. Snowflakes swirled in the pale morning light, covering the earth in a deceptive blanket of peace. But peace was nowhere to be found. Beneath the towering pines, 1,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors lay hidden, their breath steaming in the cold air, their fingers wrapped around the shafts of their bows. Red Cloud watched from the ridge, his dark eyes scanning the valley below. A lone rider emerged, his horse kicking up snow. It was Crazy Horse, the young war leader. He and his small war party galloped toward Fort Kearny, taunting the blue-coated soldiers standing at its walls. It was all part of the plan. Captain William Fetterman had been waiting for this. The arrogant officer had often boasted that with just 80 men, he could ride through the entire Sioux nation. Now, he saw his chance. Without hesitation, he ordered his troops to saddle up. Against the warnings of his commander, he led his men out of the fort and over the ridge straight into Red Cloud's trap. As soon as they disappeared into the valley, the warriors sprang from their hiding places. Arrows whistled through the air, finding their marks in the exposed soldiers. War cries echoed across the battlefield, drowning out the screams of the dying. Fetterman and his men fought desperately, but they were outnumbered 10-1. In less than half an hour, it was over. He attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and struck fear into the hearts of every soldier who dared travel the Bozeman Trail. It was the worst defeat the U.S. Army had ever suffered in the West. And it was only the beginning. The road to war. To understand Red Cloud's triumph, one must go back to the events that led to it. The American Civil War had just ended, and the U.S. government turned its attention westward. Gold had been discovered in Montana, and the quickest route to the mines was the Bozeman Trail, a path that cut straight through Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho lands. The Lakota had lived here for generations. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised them this land forever. But now, settlers and soldiers poured in, breaking the treaty as easily as a twig beneath a warrior's boot. The U.S. Army built a string of forts along the trail, including Fort Kearny, Fort Reno, and Fort C.F. Smith. The message was clear. They would take the land by force if necessary. But they had underestimated the will of the Lakota. Red Cloud, a war chief of the Oglala Lakota, would not stand by while his people's land was stolen. He was no ordinary leader. He had been raised in hardship, tested in battle, and sharpened by experience. Unlike other chiefs, he saw the necessity of unity. He gathered over 2,000 warriors from the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations tribes that often fought each other and forged them into a single, deadly force. This was no mindless rebellion. It was a war of strategy, and Red Cloud would prove himself a master of it. The Bloody Winter. The Fetterman Massacre was only one strike in a campaign that stretched across 3 brutal years. Red Cloud knew that he could not match the U.S. Army in open battle. Instead, he waged a guerrilla war. He attacked supply lines, ambushed patrols, and struck fear into the hearts of every soldier who dared travel the Bozeman Trail. In one attack, warriors swarmed a hay-cutting party outside Fort C.F. Smith. Though outnumbered, the soldiers managed to hold their ground with their new Springfield rifles, their rapid fire proving too much for the attacking warriors. It was one of the rare moments where technology won over numbers, but it was a small victory for the U.S. Army in an otherwise losing war. Back in Washington, news of Red Cloud's victories spread like wildfire. The government, already stretched thin from the aftermath of the Civil War, realized it could not afford an endless war in the West. The forts had become death traps, their soldiers prisoners in their own walls. And so, in 1868, the United States did something it had never done before. It surrendered. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, a rare native victory. At Fort Laramie, U.S. officials met with Red Cloud. The war chief arrived with 2,000 warriors at his back, a show of strength that left the Americans shaken. They knew they had no choice. The treaty they offered was unprecedented. The U.S. Army would abandon the forts. The Bozeman Trail would be closed forever. Lakota lands, including the sacred Black Hills, would remain untouched. It was a total victory for Red Cloud, one no other native leader would ever achieve again. When the soldiers left, Red Cloud and his warriors burned the forts to the ground. The legacy of Red Cloud. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Lakota had secured their homeland. But history is rarely kind to the conquered. Within a few years, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and the U.S. government, breaking yet another promise, sent miners and settlers swarming into Lakota territory. Red Cloud, now older and wiser, knew that another war would only bring destruction. He chose diplomacy, traveling to Washington, D.C. to negotiate for his people's rights. But other leaders took up the fight. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull would rise in defiance, leading their warriors to another great victory at Little Bighorn in 1876. But that triumph would be short-lived. Within years, the Lakota would face their final tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890, where hundreds of men, women, and children were massacred by U.S. soldiers. Red Cloud lived long enough to see all of this. He died in 1909 at the age of 87, his once mighty nation reduced to reservations. Yet his legacy endures. He remains the only Native American war leader to win a war against the United States. He did what no one else could: force the greatest empire of the time to abandon its forts, surrender its trail, and recognize Native sovereignty. But history is written by the victors, and Red Cloud's triumph was soon buried beneath the endless march of manifest destiny. The United States may have broken its promises, but it could never erase what he had done. Red Cloud had proven that one man, with vision and courage, could stand against an empire and win.